Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Black Bourgeoisie starting on page 98.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Break with the traditional background. The Black bourgeoisie has been uprooted from its racial tradition and, as a consequence, has no cultural roots in either the Negro or the white world. In seeking to conform to bourgeois ideals and standards of behaviors, this class in the Negro community has sloughed off the genteel tradition of the small upper class, which had its roots among the Negroes who were free before the Civil War. But more important still, the Black bourgeoisie has rejected the folk culture of the Negro masses. The artistic creations of the leaders of the Negro Renaissance in the 1920s, who turned to the Black masses for inspiration, were regarded largely with indifference by the increasing number of Negroes who were acquiring a middle class outlook on life. As a consequence of their isolation, the majority of the Black bourgeoisie live in a cultural vacuum, and their lives are devoted largely to fatuities. Passing of the gentleman and the peasant. There have been only two really vital cultural traditions in the social history of the Negro in the United States. One being the genteel tradition of the small group of mulattoes who assimilated the morals and manners of the slave-holding aristocracy, and the other, the culture of the Black folk who gave the world the spirituals. The genteel tradition flourished especially in large communities of free mulattoes, such as those in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. It was maintained by those mulatto families that had acquired, as a part of their family traditions, the patterns of behavior which were associated with the ideal of the Southern lady and the Southern gentleman. Some families took pride in the fact that a mulatto ancestor could not be distinguished in his physical appearance, dress, manners, and speech from his white half brother. As a rule, these families formed a closed circle from which were excluded all who could not boast of similar ancestry and did not conform to the same standards of morals and manners. So they isolated themselves. They were exceedingly self conscious of their culture, which consisted of the enjoyment of English and Louisiana French classical literature and music. Sometimes they maintained literary societies in which they could enjoy and foster their culture. Many of these families migrated before the Civil War to the North, where they formed a small upper class that boasted of its genteel traditions. Even when they could no longer make a living as independent tradesmen and artisans as they had done in the South, they continued to be ladies and gentlemen while gaining a livelihood as stewards in a club or in other fields of personal and domestic service. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. After the Civil War, the free mulatto class continued to hold itself aloof from the masses of freedmen. In Louisiana, the hostility of some members of this class to the newly emancipated blacks was so great that they opposed giving political rights to freedmen. But generally, the free mulatto class and its descendants assumed, as far as possible, positions of leadership among the Negro masses. Not much has changed today. They still apply that same strategy. This did not break down the traditional barriers to easy social intercourse and marriage. Even in their religious affiliations, the descendants of the free mulattoes held aloof from the Negro masses. They generally affiliated with the Episcopal, Congregational, Presbyterian, and Catholic churches, while the Negro masses, as we have seen, were affiliated with the Baptist and Methodist churches. The descendants of the free mulattoes became, after the Civil War, the core of a small upper class which undertook to maintain the American pattern of family life and conventional sex mores or morals. In some small communities in the South, a single family with its social and cultural background would live in complete isolation rather than associate with the masses of Negroes. So again, they isolate themselves. These families were able to maintain their ascendancy in the Negro community until their privileged position was destroyed by changes in Negro life. As the Negro masses acquired education, they began gradually to flout the standards of behavior and values by the genteel tradition. The ascendancy of the gentleman was not completely undermined until the mass migrations of Negroes to cities and resulting accelerated occupational differentiation of the Negro population. Sometimes these old, gentle families sought to preserve their traditions by withdrawing from the competition of the new professional classes in the Negro community. In their quiet, obscure lives, they expressed often their contempt for the Black upstarts who, in their view, and often in fact, possessed neither morals nor manners. But more often, the members of this class, which regarded the genteel tradition as its most precious heritage, had to come to terms with the representatives of the Negro masses who had acquired education, especially a professional education, or who had become successful in business. The attitude of those who came to terms with the successful members of the rising Black masses was expressed by a young mulatto college student who was a descendant of a prominent free mulatto family. Then asked how she felt when a big, ill mannered Negro male student addressed her rudely and tossed her about, she replied, "Well, since I've got to live with these niggers, I might as well act like one." So the mulatto class has always seen itself as different and separate. On the whole, the tradition of the gentleman has ceased to have influence on either the manners or morals of the Negro community. In the Negro colleges, it is futile for teachers to extort students to behave like ladies and gentlemen. In the highest social circles, the tradition of the gentleman has become a source of amusement. Even when the term is used, it is quite devoid of meaning since it refers neither to morals nor manners. Let us turn to the other cultural tradition, which represents the social heritage of the Negro masses, and see what changes it has undergone in recent decades. The folk culture of the American Negro developed out of his experiences on American soil. Whatever elements of African culture might have survived enslavement became merged with the Negro's experiences in the new environment and lost their original meaning. From the beginning, the Negro has had to learn the language of his masters, and there was no chance to preserve African languages except in some isolated areas. For example, along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia and the neighboring islands. Think about the Gullah Geechee here, or patois. The character in which the Negro family acquired under the system of slavery was due to the exigencies of servitude rather than surviving African patterns of behavior. In a situation where no legal recognition of the family existed, the dominant position of the woman in the Negro family was due to the concession that had to be made to the needs of the children as well as the attachment of the mothers to their offspring. Even in the matter of religion, there are no evidences of African survivals as in the West Indies and in Brazil. Moreover, when the folk beliefs of the Negro are studied, it is difficult to disentangle the African elements from European folklore and practices and those folk beliefs which are byproduct of the American experience. Greetings, Blanca. Thanks for tuning in. What then were some of the salient features of the folk culture of the Negro before it was disrupted by economic and social changes during the past several decades? In the Cotton Belt, the main area in which the folk cultures had flourished, the Negro was not rooted to the soil in the sense in which the European peasant has been rooted to the soil, nor have they been rooted to the soil as the Negroes in Haiti, where land owning peasantry has preserved over 5 or more generations of cultural heritage embodying many African elements. Because of the requirements of the commercial system of agriculture, there has been considerable physical mobility, especially since emancipation. Nevertheless, in his social isolation in the rural South, the Negro developed a way of life which was essentially a folk culture. The folk culture of the Negro was associated with the church, which has been the most important institution in the rural communities of the South. In fact, the community derived its name from the church, most often Baptist or Methodist, and the location of the membership of a particular church defined the limits of the communal life. It has been in the church that the Negro has found meaning for his existence, and it was the church that was enlisted his deepest loyalties. The church set up and defined the norms of behavior and moral conduct and provided the necessary discipline to enforce its rules of behavior. It was thus the chief source of social control in the Negro world, of which the whites took no notice except as their interests were affected. Next to the church, in importance and generally associated with the churches were the numerous mutual aid societies. These societies, often known as sickness and burial societies, which provided for the Negro in time of crisis, revealed their religious nature in their names, as, for example, the Brothers and Sisters of Charity, builders of the Wall of Jerusalem, and so on. In these areas where their organizations, such as the Masons, Oddfellows, or Knights of Pythias, they were evidence of the influence of the outside world. It was in the church that the Negro spirituals or religious folk songs were born. In these religious folk songs, the Negro attempted to find meaning for his existence and at the same time escape from his tragic fate. Many of these religious folk songs were sermons which were sung, preached by some master singer who was joined by the congregation. He clothed the hopes and yearnings of the Negro in the imagery and allegories of the Bible. In his spirituals, the Negro expressed his conception of the creation of man and the mystery of death and the hope of a better fate beyond the grave. But there was also a note of protest against the hard lot of the Negro in this world. The spirituals reflected, on the whole, the philosophy of life of the Negro folk. This philosophy represented an attitude of resignation in the face of a hard fate, the struggle to make a living and realize himself in a world dominated by the white man. It was otherworldly in that it looked to another world for attainment of these ends and as an escape from the evils of the present world. However, not all of the evils of the present world were the work of men or the result of natural forces. They were often the work of supernatural forces or evil spirits. Consequently, many of the folk practices of the Negro were magical formula and rituals for dealing with evil forces of the supernatural world. These folk beliefs and practices revealed the essentially religious, as opposed to the secular, character of the isolated world of the Negro folk before changes occurred in Negro life as a result of the two world wars. The folk tradition of the Negro, like the genteel tradition, has been dissipated or transformed as the result of migration and urbanization. During their wanderings, the Negro folk have created the blues, which tell of their disillusionments and nostalgic yearnings for the sympathy and understanding of the world of the folk which they have left. The secular folk songs of these Black troubadours in American industrial society are living records of the reactions of the uprooted Black folk in the world of the city. In the countless storefront churches of northern cities, the Negro migrant has vainly attempted to cling to the traditional religious life of the rural South, but more often, with the loss of his simple faith in the world of the city, he has sought salvation in the various religious cults, some with nationalistic aims, which are indicative of his gropings to find an escape from the white man's world. His mutual aid societies, which once provided protection in time of crisis, have lost their meaning in a world where social assistance is provided by great impersonal organizations. As the result of contacts with the public school, the children of the folk have sloughed off their folk beliefs of their parents and leaned into the secular scientific techniques of survival in the urban environment. Thus, instead of their old resignation toward the world, the Negro masses are acquiring a confidence with the efficacy of their efforts through the use of the ballot and in joining with fellow workers in the labor unions. It sounds like he was a bit of a socialist communist, so make sure, just be aware of that. The Renaissance that failed. As the result of the uprooting of the traditions of the gentleman and the peasant, two movements of unique significance developed among the Negroes. One was the only truly nationalistic movement ever to appear among Negroes, and the other a literary and artistic renaissance which turned to the Black masses for inspiration. The movement with nationalistic aims was known as the Garvey movement, taking its name from its leader, Marcus Garvey, a West Indian. It was no accident that this movement was led by a West Indian Negro. Garvey, who was apparently of pure Negro ancestry, was born in Jamaica in 1885, where he had undertaken to organize a Negro Improvement Association, a scheme which he had conceived during his travels in England and France. After its failure in Jamaica, he came to the United States during the First World War. His attempt to create a similar movement in the United States did not meet with much success until large numbers of Negroes began to migrate to New York City from the West Indies. With a large nucleus of West Indian Negroes in Harlem, he began to make an appeal on purely racial grounds to the Negro masses, especially the disillusioned Negroes from the South who had failed to find the promised land which they sought in the North. The program of the Garvey movement was based upon the thesis that since the Negro would never achieve equality and justice in a white man's country, the only solution of his problem was the establishment of an independent nation in Africa. In his appeal to the masses of Americans, as well as West Indian Negroes, Garvey exhibited a keen understanding of the hurt self esteem and frustrations of Black men in the United States. He launched a newspaper called The Negro World, in which he not only made articulate the resentments of the Negro, but provided a vision of a new promised land in Africa. Through his speeches in Liberty Hall in Harlem, in the literature which he disseminated, and in the organization he set up, he created a new valuation of everything Black or Negro. He was an excellent propagandist. He created a military organization which was to be the vanguard of the African army, and he organized a corps of Black Cross nurses. He invented honors and distinctions which caused the Negro to feel that he was a part of a great cause. He set up stores and restaurants and started a project for a fleet of steamships that would bind Negroes in America to Africa. Although the movement had its largest following in New York City, it spread to Chicago, Detroit, and even Philadelphia, and attracted some Negroes in southern cities. But the movement collapsed when Garvey was sent to the penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, for using the mails for fraudulent purposes and promoting his projected steamship lines to Africa. The messianic element of this movement is revealed in the message to his followers that appeared in the Negro World under the caption, "If I Die in Atlanta," in which he wrote, "Look for me in the whirlwind or storm. Look for me all around you. For with God's grace, I shall come and bring with me the countless millions of Black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies, and the millions in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life." The Garvey movement did not attract any support from the emerging Black bourgeoisie. In fact, Garvey, who had been acquainted with the deep cleavage between the mulatto middle class and the Black masses in Jamaica, made the mistake of attacking Negro leaders with white ancestry in the United States, where even the remotest Negro ancestry classified a person as Negro. But if he had not made this mistake, he would still not have enlisted the support of the increasing numbers of Negroes who were acquiring the middle class status. They did not only regard his programs as fantastic, but they did not want to associate with his illiterate and poor Black followers, especially since West Indians were prominent in the movement. The young intellectuals among the emerging Black bourgeoisie called themselves the New Negro. They began expressing their orientation of American life in what has become known to be in what has been known as the Negro Renaissance. The first fruits of the Negro Renaissance were published in the New Negro, edited by Allen Locke in 1925. It is significant that one of the contributors of this volume was James Weldon Johnson, whose poem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, originally written for school children in Jacksonville, Florida, was becoming a sort of national Negro hymn. In his poem, Johnson had endowed the enslavement of the Negro and his struggles for freedom with a certain nobility. In his book, 50 Years and Other Poems, was published in 1917 when the migration of Southern Negroes to northern cities was at its height. One poem in this book expressed the dominant spirit of the Negro Renaissance. It was entitled, O Black and Unknown Bards, in which the poet asks, how came your lips to touch the sacred fire? How, in your darkness, did you come to know the power and beauty of the minstrel's lyre? The forecast says the new Negro movement he talking about, the Harlem Renaissance. Yes, he is talking about the Harlem Renaissance. In this poem, James Weldon Johnson was expressing a reevaluation of the spirituals which many Negroes had rejected as part of the heritage of slavery. According to Locke, the editor of the New Negro, the younger generation had achieved an objective attitude toward life, and in shaking off the psychology of imitation and implied inferiority. The Negro was achieving something like a spiritual emancipation. In more concrete terms, Sterling Brown has described the Negro Renaissance as being concerned with one, the discovery of Africa as a source of race pride, two, a use of Negro heroes and heroic episodes from American history, three, propaganda of protest, four, a treatment of the Negro masses, frequently of the folk, less often of the workers, with more understanding and less apology. And five, franker and deeper reevaluation of self. Some of this subject matter called for romantic approach, some for a realistic approach. As one studies the literary and artistic productions of the Negro Renaissance, there is an indication that Negro intellectuals and artists are acquiring a more objective attitude toward their experience in American life, and that they were overcoming their feelings of inferiority. Much of the fiction of the Negro Renaissance indicates not only an objective attitude toward the past, but a sympathetic understanding of the lives of the Negro masses. Likewise, the poetry of Count Cullen, Langston Hughes, and others, there is no apology for the free, unconventional life of the Negro masses. The New Negro movement was one of my favorite generations, but it's different from the Harlem Renaissance with the Black elites. Yes, it is. The forecast says, but the New Negro movement itself was different. Many Black men came from World War I with guns and training and willing to shoot back. Yes. The distinctive contributions of Sterling Brown, who was identified with the Negro Renaissance, were his poems, which revealed the ironic humor of the Negro folk who had left their rural background to wander and work in the white man's civilization. The spiritual emancipation of which Locke wrote did not affect the emerging Black bourgeoisie. They did not react, however, as the small Negro elite comprised mostly of mulattoes had reacted at the beginning of the century against the dialect of poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the first Negro poet to treat with humor and sympathetic understanding the Negro rural folk. They were critical of what they had called common Negroes in literature, and on the whole, the Black bourgeoisie either ignored the Negro Renaissance or, when they exhibited any interest in it, they revealed their ambivalence toward the Negro masses. Remember that the Black bourgeoisie, benignly neglect the Negro masses. Although very few of the increasing number of the middle class Negroes read the literary productions of the Negro Renaissance or saw the work of the artists identified in it, they would refer to the achievements of this period as a defense against the implications of their racial inferiority. Mobility and money. When Harlem in New York City became the mecca of the new Negro and the center of the Negro Renaissance, the capital of the Black bourgeoisie was Durham, North Carolina. In this city were located the most spectacular achievements of Negroes in the field of business enterprise. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, the Bankers Fire Insurance Company, and the National Negro Finance Corporation. All of those are financial institutions, banks and insurance companies. These enterprises had grown out of pioneering efforts of men who had little experience with business, but they had been inspired by the current faith promulgated or created by Negro leaders that business enterprise would open the way to equality and acceptance in white America. One of the pioneers had started out as a barber and with his savings had bought a fraternal organization. Later, he joined with the physician and a manager of a grocery store, still promoting the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Success in this undertaking led them into other forms of business whenever an opportunity to promote some enterprise appeared. Although the promoters of these enterprises were inspired by the spirit of modern business, they exhibited at the beginning of their careers the old-fashioned virtues of the old middle class. Their lives reveal none of the Negro's love of leisure and enjoyment of life. They were frugal and abstemious in their habits. They strove to attain middle class respectability through industry and morality. They maintained middle class ideals. In fact, in the 1920s, the children of the founders of these Negro enterprises were beginning to assume positions of control in these business undertakings. Because of the influence of these families, the Negro community in Durham, with its fine homes, exquisite churches, and middle class respectability, was regarded as the capital of the Black bourgeoisie. As the Black bourgeoisie has grown in size and influence, Durham has ceased to enjoy the distinction of being its capital. The Negro communities in Chicago and Detroit have both claimed to have become the center of the Black bourgeoisie. In either case, the shift of the capital of the Black bourgeoisie from a small southern city to a northern metropolis is indicative of the change in the character and outlook of this class. Although the younger generations of the Negro businessmen in Durham had acquired more thoroughly than the pioneers the psychology of the modern businessman, they were still influenced by the older traditions that had grown up in the Negro community. They still conformed to the tradition of the gentleman, which lingered and shaped their morals and manners. They still felt some identification with the Negro masses, despite the fact that their interests might be opposed to those of the masses. This was partly due to the fact that as well as the Negro masses lived that they, as well as the Negro masses, lived under a system of rigid racial segregation. Moreover, they were closely identified with the institutions in the Negro communities which were supported by the masses. On the other hand, the Black bourgeoisie, which has become important in recent years, has tended to break completely with the traditions of the Negro. As the system of rigid racial segregation has broken down, the Black bourgeoisie has lost much of its feeling of racial solidarity with the Negro masses, so integration destroyed any links we had to one another. In the metropolitan areas of the North, where there are increasing opportunities for employment and earning money, social mobility, which means primarily the attainment of middle class status, has become a question of the amount of money which one has to spend. When a French sociologist on a study tour in the United States saw the emergence of the Black bourgeoisie in northern cities, he observed that they were really colored Babbitts. The break and with traditional values is seen in the changes in the canons of respectability. Among the older upper class families in the Negro community who really stood for a middle class way of life, the canons of respectability required a stable family life and conventional sexual behavior. On the other hand, among the new Black bourgeoisie, these values are regarded as old fashioned virtues, and there is much confusion in thinking and behavior with reference to these values. Divorces and scandals in family and sex behavior do not affect one's social status. Rather, the notoriety which one acquires in such cases adds to one's prestige. The change in attitudes towards the old fashioned bourgeois values is due largely to the fact that the new bourgeoisie is recruited from those elements of the Negro population among whom these virtues never really existed, and that money has become the chief requirement for social acceptance. So, as they began to value green over black, then they began to change their values where money was more important than the genteel virtues that we talked about earlier. Among the professional classes in the Negro community, actors and entertainers are relatively numerous and have the largest incomes. The actors and entertainers, who very often have a lower class background in the social hierarchy of the Negro community, exercise a far greater influence upon the morals and manners of the Negro community than the actors and entertainers in the white community. That's still true to this very day. They put actors, comedians, basketball players, and athletes in front of us as representative Negroes that they expect to lead the Negro masses. Their prestige is owing partly to the glamour of their personalities, but more especially to their financial success, which is due to their support by the white world. So white people pick our leaders for us. The Black bourgeoisie is also being recruited from the successful underworld Negroes who have gained their money from gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and the numbers. The old upper class in the Negro community erected an impenetrable barrier between themselves and the Negroes who represented the sporting and criminal world. Since such Negroes were generally able to handle more money than the majority of Negroes, they always constituted a threat to the respectable way of life cherished by the old middle classes. As the result of urbanization, which upset the old class structure of the Negro community, the sporting and criminal elements began to acquire a dominant position among Negroes. With the emergence of the new black bourgeoisie, the standards of consumption which the sporting and criminal elements are able to maintain have become the measure of success among the black middle class. The standards which they set are emulated by Negroes in the professional classes, such as doctors, lawyers, dentists, and even teachers, as far as they are able to do so. But more important still, in order to secure the money necessary to maintain these standards, Negro professional men engage in the same rackets as the successful Negroes of the underworld. Consequently, among the black bourgeoisie, an expensive automobile, a palatial residence, and a yacht bring more recognition to a doctor than some achievement in medicine. So the things that they can possess are more important than their actual professional achievements. At the summer resorts, where the black bourgeoisie gather to display their wealth, the descendants of the old respectable families must defer to the underworld elements who, through their money, have risen to the top of Negro society. The deeper significance of the break in the Negro's traditional background is revealed in the religious outlook and behavior of the black bourgeoisie. As we have seen in the last chapter, in moving up the social ladder, Negroes have tended to leave the Baptist and Methodist churches and have affiliated with the Episcopal, Congregational, and Presbyterian churches, and to a less extent, with the Catholic Church. In the past, this has usually meant that Negroes who were rising in the social scale mainly because of education were seeking a form of religious expression more in accord with their developed religious sentiments. But with the emergence of the new black bourgeoisie, a radical change has occurred in the religious outlook and practices of those who have risen to the top of their social pyramid. Religion has become secular and practical in the sense that it no longer is concerned with the mystery and meaning of life, and that it has become divorced from any real religious sentiment. The Church of the Negro masses, like the fraternal organizations, is regarded as an instrument for the advancement of the interests of the black bourgeoisie, while the churches with which the black bourgeoisie affiliate are regarded as part of the social paraphernalia of this class. They give money to the churches of the masses as an expenditure for good public relations. The contributions which they make to the churches with which they themselves are affiliated have become a form of conspicuous consumption. So they give in an attempt to show off their wealth. But they have little time or sympathy for the traditional religion of the Negro as expressed in the spirituals. Such religion, according to their view, belongs to the past, which should be forgotten. Having abandoned their social heritage and being rejected by the white world, the black bourgeoisie have an intense feeling of inferiority, constantly seek various forms of recognition, and place great value upon the status symbols in order to compensate for their inferiority complex. In the following chapter, we shall trace the sources of this inferiority complex and study the struggle of the Black bourgeoisie to achieve status and recognition in American society. So, as you can see, they have their challenges, they have their problems. Conspicuous consumption is a sport for them, even in their religious life. I'm going to read part of the next chapter going into their inferiority complex, and then we'll be done for the night. Inferiority complex and the quest for status. The entire history of the Negro in the United States has been of a nature to create in the Negro a feeling of racial inferiority. During the more than 20 years, during the more than 22 centuries of enslavement by the white man, every means was employed to stamp a feeling of inferiority in the Negro's soul. Christianity and the Bible were utilized to prove and to give a divine sanction to his alleged racial inferiority, or, as some contended, his exclusion from the races of mankind. When the system of slavery was uprooted in the Second American Revolution, it appeared for a brief period that the Negro might receive recognition as a man. But as a result of the unresolved class conflict in which the democratic forces of the South were defeated, the demagogues who became leaders of the disinherited whites, but really served the interest of the property classes, made the Negro the scapegoat. A legalized system of racial segregation was established, which stigmatized the Negro, was unfit for human association, and every type of propaganda was employed to prove that the Negro was morally degenerate and intellectually incapable of being educated. And that's the benefit of the Garvey program, because Garvey had a system of propaganda which turned that particular ideology on its head. Living constantly under the domination and contempt of the white man, the Negro came to believe in his own inferiority. Whether he ignored or accepted the values of the white man's world, the Black bourgeoisie, the element which has striven more than any other element among Negroes to make itself over in the image of the white man, exhibits most strikingly the inferiority complex of those who would escape their racial identification. So they're trying to escape from their Negro identity. A chattel in an alien land. When the Constitution of the United States was adopted, it provided that the number of representatives from each state in the House of Representatives would be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 of all other persons referred, of course, to the Negroes, and the agreement to count the Negro as 3/5 of a person was a compromise between the position that slaves should not be counted at all and the desire on the part of Southern states to have as large a representation as possible. Although the Negro was finally counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress, his actual status as a person in the Southern society was probably more accurately described by the Charleston Mercury, which stated that the Negro was as much an article of commerce as sugar and molasses, which he produced. Despite the human relations which developed between Negroes and whites on the plantation, where a paternalistic type of control developed, the Negro was nevertheless an article of commerce or an animate tool according to Aristotle's definition of a slave. If any recognition were shown to him as a person, it was conceded to a person who represented a lower and inferior order of mankind. During and for a brief period following the American Revolution, some of the leaders who acquired French ideas concerning human rights expressed their opposition to the enslavement of the Negro. For example, Thomas Jefferson attacked slavery in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, in which he declared that the King of England had waged cruel war against human nature itself in supporting the slave trade. Such sentiments in regard to the enslavement of the Negro were not shared by the plantation owners in the Lower South. Jefferson was a Virginian, and the plantation system of agriculture was becoming unprofitable in Virginia. When, as a result of technological developments in the textile industries in England, there was a great demand for cotton, and Eli Whitney perfected his cotton gin. The idealism concerning human rights ceased to have any reference to the Negro except among a small group of whites in New England. During the period from 1790 to 1808, the year in which importation of slaves became illegal, over 100,000 slaves were brought to the United States. And because of the failure of the federal government to suppress the slave trade after 1808, between 250 and 300,000 more were smuggled into the country. Reduced to chattel in an alien land, the enslaved Negro was not only detribalized as the African who had contact with European civilization, but he was annihilated as a person. Although the detribalized African may take up permanent residence in a town and sever relations with his chief and his relatives, there is always the tribal organization to which he can return or the traditional culture with which he can identify. The enslavement of the Negro in the United States destroyed not only his family ties and his household gods, it effaced whatever memories of the African homeland that had survived the Middle Passage. The destruction of a common tradition and religious beliefs and practices reduced the Negro to a mere atom without a personality or a social identity. The main significance of the proselytizing of the Baptist and Methodist missionaries was that Christianity was presented to the slaves in a simple emotional appeal that provided a release for their frustrated and repressed lives. More than that, it established a bond of union among the slaves and provided them with a meaning of their existence in an alien world. Although Christianity offered the Negro an interpretation of his existence in an alien world, it did not undertake to change his earthly condition as regards to his enslavement. When for economic reasons, during the 17th century, the Negro indentured servant lost the status which white indentured servants had and became a servant for life or a slave, the colonial legislatures made it clear that that conversion to Christianity meant freedom not for the body in this world, but for the soul in the afterlife. Nor did the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which began its missionary efforts among Negroes in the 18th century, offer the Negro slave any escape from the subordination to the white man in this world. Greetings, Ani Ak. Ani Ak says the Harlem Renaissance was introduced distract and derail the new Negro movement and Mosiah Garvey. Christian missionaries who undertook the conversion of Negroes during most of the 18th century, only the Quakers, who generally met with opposition among the planters, were in favor of emancipation of the slaves. However, none of the proselytizing faiths attracted large numbers of Negroes until the Baptists and Methodists began their missionary efforts during the closing years of the 18th century. In the beginning, the Baptist and Methodist missionaries who brought their message of salvation to the poor and outcast were in favor of the emancipated slaves, but they soon accommodated their message of salvation to the earthly condition of the Negro slave. Missionaries are on a mission, and they are coming to sell you their ideas of an afterlife that will set you free, so that the only freedom you can find is in death, and that the toil that you put in this world will in some way, shape, form, or fashion manifest as release in the next world. Not only did Christianity fail to offer the Negro hope of freedom in this world, but the manner in which Christianity was communicated to him tended to degrade him. The Negro was taught that his enslavement was due to the fact that he had been cursed by God. This is that Ham's curse thing that they talk about. His very color was a sign of the curse which he had received as a descendant of Ham. Parts of the Bible were carefully selected to prove that had intended that the Negro should be the servant of the white man, and that he would always be a hewer of wood and drawer of water. While such was being taught the slave, some of the leading ministers of the South were setting forth the same doctrine in books for the American public. One of these books, written by a Presbyterian minister and entitled The Christian Doctrine of Slavery, stated that it may be that Christian slavery is God's solution of the problem, relation of labor and capital, about which the wisest statesmen of Europe confessed themselves at fault. Another leading minister published a book entitled Slavery Ordained by God, in which he defended the doctrine that slavery is ordained by God and to continue for the good of the slave, the good of the master, the good of the whole American family, until another and better destiny may be unfolded. These theological justifications of the enslavement of the Negro gave religious support to the philosophical justifications of slavery, the most celebrated of which was that by a professor of history, metaphysics, and political law at William and Mary College in Virginia. In a book published in 1832, he justified the enslavement of the Negro on the grounds that the Negro possessed the strength and form of a man, but had the intellect of a child and was therefore unfit for freedom. But you transplanted that person from their original environment. And once you took them out of their environment where there was abundance and put them in an environment where there is lack and work and want, of course, their minds have not been developed to thrive in that particular society because they had their own society. Since the Negro's black skin was a sign of the curse of God and his inferiority to the white man, therefore a light complexion resulting from the racial mixture raised a mulatto above the level of the unmixed Negro. Although mulattoes were not always treated better than blacks, as a rule they were taken into the household or were apprenticed to a skilled artisan. Partly because of the differential treatment accorded to mulattoes, but more especially because of the general degradation of the Negro as a human being. The Negro of mixed ancestry thought of himself as being superior to the unmixed Negro. His light complexion became his most precious possession. Witness, for example, the typical case of mulatto slave begging Frances Kimball that she be put to some other than field labor because hoeing in the field was so hard on her on account of her color. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Happy Patrice Lumumba Day and happy Medgar Evers Day. Thank you so much for tuning in. Concerning the prestige which white blood conferred, Miss Kimball observed that the slaves accepted the contempt of their masters to such an extent that they profess and really seem to feel it for themselves, and the faintest admixture of white blood in their veins appears at once, by common consent of their own race, to raise them in the scale of humanity. So just because their relative was raped and their bloodline was interrupted, they perceived themselves better. Nearly 600,000 mulattoes among the somewhat less than 4.5 million Negroes in the United States in 1860 were the result of sexual association of white men and Negro women. The character of the sexual association between white men and Negro women ranged from rape based upon physical force or the authority of the master to voluntary surrender on the part of the Negro woman. Voluntary surrender on the part of the Negro woman was due at times to mutual attraction, but the prestige of the white race was often sufficient to secure compliance on their part. There was also the trickery where they said, if you do this for me, your children will be free. They would they would convince these women that if they had sex and she got a sucker or a baby, which is what they called them, suckers, then that child would be free. That was often a lie. And there were often times where they would just force themselves upon these women. In giving themselves to their white masters, there were certain concrete advantages to be gained, such as freedom from the drudgery of field work. Not altogether freedom, but freedom from the drudgery of field work, better food and clothing, and the prospect of having their half white children enjoy certain privileges and perhaps be emancipated. As the mulatto class grew in the South, many slaveholders, if married, set up a separate household for their black, but more often mulatto concubines. In some cases, they lived a monogamous life with their mulatto mistress or concubine, legal marriage being forbidden. But even under the most favorable conditions, the woman and her offspring were often stigmatized because of their Negro ancestry. It was out of such association that the communities of free mulattoes grew up in the South. In some parts of the South, they constituted a sort of lower caste, since no matter how well off they might be economically, they always bore the stigma of Negro ancestry. Even in Louisiana, where quadroons or gens de color became wealthy and sent their children to France to be educated, they were still without political rights and could not associate with whites on the basis of equality. But they, like free mulattoes in Charleston, South Carolina, and other localities, would not associate with blacks. The Free Negroes of Charleston, who organized the Brown Fellowship in 1790, admitted only brown men. This society provided for the education of the free people of color, assisted widows and orphans, and maintained a clubhouse and a cemetery for its members. They identified themselves as far as possible with the interests of the white slaveholding aristocracy and did not even permit a discussion of slavery among their members. Although they were not white, they could thank God that they were not black. Religion and political philosophy rallied to the support of planters in the South by confirming the racial inferiority of the Negro. This support became especially urgent as the conflict between economic interests of the North and South became more acute, and in the issue over slavery required a moral character. Whether the Negro was only chattel property and therefore had no rights as a human being became an issue of the celebrated Dred Scott case, which was taken to the Supreme Court. In 1857, Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court, which was dominated by the South, handed down a famous decision. A Negro has no rights which a white man need respect. The court declared that in the meaning of the words people of the United States in the Constitution, Negroes were not included in the people of the United States. This represented the final triumph of the Southern aristocracy in its struggle to dominate the United States. And we're going to stop right there. I thank each and every one of you for tuning in tonight. I try to read only for an hour so that you guys don't get tired out. But as you can see, they value their mulatto skin color more than they value the black masses because their skin color becomes a form of currency for them. Because if you can pass, you can get access to capital, you can get access to resources, you can get access to other things that the black Negro masses do not have access to. And one of the things that you'll notice is that uh, with the exception of a Benjamin Banneker and a few other notable Negro people, you'll notice that many of our great Negro firsts were actually mulatto, and they are held out as the exceptional men, but they are not always looking for that recognition in their field of study. They're looking for that when they're of the bourgeoisie class, they're looking to get that recognition because they have a house or a really nice car, or they own a yacht, or they have a home in the Hamptons, or they can vacation abroad, and all of these other things. And that may help explain some of what Booker T. Washington was going through when he got to go to Europe. What do you guys think? Jijen says Dred Scott was the nail in the coffin of the idea of equality. As you can see, there have been a lot of nails in the coffin uh, of equality, and they keep being hammered down over and over and over again, continuing to reinforce these ideas that we are not equal. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight?
Hey, how you doing, Matron?
I'm good.
Yeah, I just wanted to no, I was first of all great reading. And I just wanted to say that okay, I live in Louisiana. I live in Shreveport, Louisiana. Now about 50, 60 miles south of me, it's a city called Natchitoches, Louisiana. Have you ever heard of it?
I have heard of Natchitoches. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Natchitoches, Louisiana. Okay, the French settled in Natchitoches originally, like in the early 1700s. So it was a French settlement, but it was about as far north in Louisiana that they had went. But anyway, in Natchitoches, Louisiana, they had a mixed race group of people. These are people who have mixed French and African ancestry, and they're still there today. And they're known as the Cane River Creoles.
Mm.
Real light skinned people. They're real light skinned people. You can tell that they got some black blood, black roots in them somewhere, but they're very light skinned. That's one of my cousins married into their family, but they call
Oh, wow.
they call the Cane River Creoles, and it's just like you were saying, like you was reading. They viewed themselves as a people apart. They didn't associate with black people like black people like me, or
Right.
you. They didn't
Right.
associate with us, and they kind of like they wanted to be they was damn near white, but they weren't white. You know what I'm saying? So they was caught between that, but at the same time, they're like, we ain't got all the rights that we want to have, but we better than them black people though.
Exactly. Yeah.
But they're known as the Cane River Creoles. A lot of them was named like Matoya. That was like one of the biggest families, and my cousin married into the Matoya family. But yeah, that's a real thing because a lot of people don't believe it. They think it was something that was like 300 years ago, but that was a very real thing.
That's happening still to this day because even when you have children that have an all black mother and one all black parent and one white parent, or one parent that's something else, they're always going to choose their white side. They
Exactly.
always choose to mate hypergamously, trying to go to the one that has the higher social status
Yes,
and
ma'am.
or racial status.
Yes, ma'am. Exactly. But I ain't gonna hold you, matron. I just wanted to throw that in, for everybody to hear.
Well, I appreciate you as always, Anthony McPhail. You always have wonderful insights and extra information that we can chew on. And like I
Okay.
said, this is a book club. This is the learning curve. It's a place for us to all learn and grow.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you, matron.
Oh, hold on. The forecast is joining. 1 second.
Okay.
Mhm. Hey, forecast. How you doing tonight?
Hey, what's going on, matron? What's up, Anthony?
Hey, what's up, forecast?
Not much. This was a great reading, matron. Another great job.
This is why I'm always talking about the mulatto problem when you talk to me.
Yeah.
Hey, look, you ain't got to tell me. I done got in trouble enough messing with the mulattoes. But I wanted to touch on the new Negro movement real quick because like that was like my favorite kind of generation of black people. It was
Yeah.
like a lot of the black people coming out from like 1919 from the war, and they had their shotguns, and they was protecting their community. But
Yeah.
even the way that they display it now, like he was talking about the Harlem Renaissance part of it, where they had like the actors and celebrities and stuff writing poems and stuff. And I was going to actually say something about Alan Locke's book, but it's really just poetry. It's not even nothing in there but poetry and stuff.
Yeah. Hey, yeah. Hey, 4K. Major, could I say something real quick, Major?
Go ahead.
Okay. This is one thing that we need that a lot of us don't know. Well, we probably know. I know Major knows. The Harlem Renaissance, like we look at it, a lot of people look at it with all this nostalgia and how it was the burgeoning of black art and all that. The Harlem Renaissance was created by white people to destroy the Marcus Garvey movement.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? It was
Yes.
not something like that we, as with brothers and sisters with black conscience like us, should like be something to be proud of. Okay, yeah, we celebrate the talent of our people, but that movement was created to destroy the Garvey movement, to destroy the momentum of the Garvey movement. That's what it was created by white people. All those artists were funded by white people. You had every now and then one of them to go off a script like Claude McKay and say some real stuff like that poem he wrote about If We Must Die. But I was just saying, that was created to destroy the momentum of the Garvey movement. And I'll knock off right there.
Yeah, that's a fact. I agree. That's pretty much what I was gonna say. That's why they promote the Harlem Renaissance more so than the New Negro movement. But if you could find something on the real New Negro movement like that, like you should look it up. And somebody else, by the way, somebody else who funded the Harlem Renaissance was not CJ Watt, the sister from Virginia who was rich, but her daughter, after she died, she got her money. Who
Yeah,
is her?
Madam C.J. Walker,
Right.
you thinking right.
Okay, yeah, her daughter was funding a lot of that stuff with the Harlem Renaissance part. But like no, you like he was saying because it came with ulterior motives. Like my brother Anthony was saying, it was them, but she was the one black person who did it too. So, and she wasted all that money that she left her behind, Madam C.J. Walker. But that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, you have a few Negroes that were wealthy, that were but you got to remember what class they were in. That's where the class challenge comes into place, because her daughter thought that her money could buy her access into white society, or to at least be at the very top of Negro society. And so she would had the interests of her daughter were aligned to rich white people, or to the white property class, more so than it was aligned to the black people who were Garveyites. Because when you look at resistance movements all usually start from a place of racial pride, morals, and armed resistance. And when you get beyond that and you go off into the arts and all this alternative lifestyle stuff that they go into, that alphabet soup community, and supporting and shaking hands with non-black people, that's when you get off into these people that whose interests really align themselves more with wealthy white people, or white people that have a little something to lose, versus the black masses, which is what they should be supporting.
Yep, yeah, that's a fact, and yeah, that's all I really wanted to say. And her daughter, I think would have been considered in the black bourgeoisie, at the time, even with the time of E. Franklin Frazier, So, I think she would have been considered in there because she was one of the richer upper class Negroes back then. So, but yeah, this is a great reading though, Matron. I definitely appreciate you for it.
Well, I appreciate you, and I thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Anthony McPhail. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Oh, no, ma'am, that was it, matron. That was it. I'm good.
Oh,
I really enjoyed the reading.
well, thank you. Thank you. And thanks for tuning in, guys. I want to thank Anthony McPhail and Forecast for both coming on the broadcast and for joining the show. I want to thank Ani Ankh. I want to thank Jai Jin, Blanca J, and you, even you, for listening today. I appreciate you. I know KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Raw and her elders are listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. Thank you to for the donations and contributions that you sent from the Daycare Ladies Network and from the Anthony Adrian Academy. I know their staff are listening. I know that the staff over at Jesse's Kids are listening, and you, even you, all my new subscribers. I value each and every one of you, and I thank you for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace, guys.